Thanks everyone for still staying on. And basically, this talk today is based on interviews that I conducted with vegan men. And there were 61 vegan men I interviewed in Finland and in Estonia. And I don't have time to talk more about them, but you can ask me later if you want to. But definitely I should say that these men were privileged men in terms of at least gender, race, ethnicity, class, and that's quite important. So we cannot really, the findings and conclusions cannot really apply them to all men, and we have to consider that positionality of these men. And I'm currently in the process of writing a book on this material, which covers a lot of different topics that I covered in the interviews as well. And one important focus of mine is how men's veganism and kind of veganism and masculinity relate to gender equality and social equality more broadly. So that's what I'm covering in the book as well, and I'm going to touch upon today as well. Okay, so today's focus, I want to a little bit talk about those questions that I have here. So what's the significance of environmental motivations in men's veganism? Like, how do they see it themselves? And also one thing is how they kind of, for them and how they kind of communicate this, these motivations to, let's say, a sympathetic interviewer, as I was, a fellow vegan, versus if they're communicating veganism to others, let's say omnivores, and maybe in some hostile, uncomfortable situations. So there's actually a difference here, I can tell you already. And one thing also briefly touching upon, so the role of emotions in these experiences and communication strategies, because actually men, particularly privileged men, haven't been associated with emotions, and maybe it's also considered not masculine to express emotions. But I will actually show you that the way they talked about veganism and also environment, it was quite emotional. And also actually looking a little bit at these implications of these communication strategies that they were using. And shortly to say that actually, as you might be aware of, environmental arguments are used a lot nowadays, and increasingly even by vegans to justify veganism. And there's a study that said that, and actually about how important environment is for vegans, that concern behind the veganism. In the US, 59% of vegans and vegetarians mention environmental concerns as a big important motivation behind the veganism. But actually there hasn't been so much maybe critical engagement with this, and also from the gender perspective. And there's been some recent research that problematizes this tactic, kind of says that maybe that kind of sometimes sidelines animals, and we remain quite anthropocentric in these discussions. But yeah, so what about these men whom I interviewed? So what was the importance of environmental concerns in their veganism? Actually, for most men in the study, so out of those 61, it was typical that environment and climate, those issues were important for them, important drivers behind the veganism. And typically, this took second place behind ethical issues, but very, very typically it was combined. So they really, for them, environment was a big motivation. And they learned about environmental effects of intensive animal farming upon going vegan. It was very typical to look at these documentaries like Cowspiracy, and they really kind of expanded their knowledge significantly on the links between the animal industry and environmental harm. And actually some men they claimed to have been environmentally conscious already before going vegan. And they were conscious about the carbon footprint of the meat industry. And so definitely, when you already had those concerns before, and then going vegan and hearing about those environmental concerns and links between animal industry and climate change, it resonated with them. So it kind of became quite a big reason why to go vegan. And one interesting concept that I found that I'm using in my work is eco-anxiety. I came across it quite recently, and that actually relates to emotions as well and affects So this refers to feelings of worry and concern about climate change and environmental destruction, and also very much about one's own future, about it and the planet's future, seen as interrelated. A lot of people are feeling this these days. And key elements of this eco-anxiety are like uncertainty, unpredictability, uncontrollability. So it's really out of your control, and it produces quite a lot of anxiety. And although these feelings are negative, we could say that they can help to mobilize people to take action about ecological issues. And these vegan men in my study experienced this eco-anxiety quite strongly when they learned about the devastating impacts of the animal industry on the climate. And really they talked about this quite emotionally. So there were these intense like feelings and affects, like a shock, anxiety, sadness that they expressed, as well as a sense of urgency. So definitely, if somebody says that talking about the environment in relation to consuming animals is all about facts and figures, I mean, that's also something that I'll come to, but definitely it's also very emotional. I just want to say entangled with emotions and affects. Here I do have quite a long quote from Kalev, an Estonian research participant who actually saw cowspiracy, and he was quite affected by that. And in parallel to this, he read a book which was called A Farewell to Ice. And these experiences made him kind of make the connections and think about going vegan. And he says, just read a bit selectively. So he became quite concerned about humanity and was disappointed in humanity and said that humanity has played itself into a corner. And he says, I was already interested in environmental issues before, but I always imagined that humanity is big and powerful. We are pretty much moving towards the stars. Soon we'll be going to Mars, and then beyond that, everything is going uphill. But this scientist made the point that once the ice melts in the Arctic, that's the end of our civilization, the entire civilization, and it can happen already in 5 years. And so since then, my worldview changed like 180 degrees. I had terrible stress, and I fell into deep depression when I understood what climate change actually means. And when I watched Cowspiracy, I put this all together, and I realized how helpful it would be if humanity changed itself, how much it would help in terms of the environment if you became vegan. So that's what he says. And you could kind of think that a lot of this, his concerns are about humanity's fate here. Maybe he remains here quite anthropocentric, we could say. But yeah, of course, he connects this to eating animals and veganism. And here you can definitely see here how it was quite emotional, that experience, and the shock and terrible stress and depression he talks about, and how that actually then leads to this kind of rational decision to go vegan. And so kind of what I'm saying too is emotions and rationality are so entangled, you can't really separate them well. And this is, very shortly, that's also what I'm going to do. What I'm doing in my work is really actually that point, how emotions are very, very much also guiding our lives, and they are feminized and quite undervalued, but actually men are also experiencing them, feeling them. It's just a matter of how they are expressed and how those expressions are judged by others. But yeah, emotions are very significant in this context. That's all I'm going to say about it now. But so this, what I talked about now, was really how they kind of felt and how they expressed these things to me as another vegan, very sympathetic interviewer. And that matters. But then in other contexts, so I also studied this, how they actually talk about veganism to others, to omnivores, in a different context. And what I found is that communicating veganism is very contextual. So in different situations, in communication with others, the men didn't always express what they considered personally the most important aspects of veganism, but what they perceived as appropriate or effective in this given setting. And this also included, strategically using the term vegan. Sometimes they didn't. We talked about that before in this conference today, how sometimes plant-based is used. But Thomas here says, if someone asks, and if they are informed, I say that I'm vegan. If they are not informed, and if we talk about food, then I somehow navigate. I say that I eat plant-based food. So he's saying, I'm not interested in defending my vegan ground. I'm interested in impact. I do not invest in my vegan identity. I think that's really interesting. So in a way, when he communicates this, what comes across is actually the animal ethics. Maybe we don't hear about at all. It's about just the diet. Sometimes he talks about. So definitely, this is a very selective presentation of veganism, and it requires a lot of reading of the situation, what the other people in that situation expect, or what you think they expect. So that means that veganism also gets presented in different ways, in different circumstances. Definitely also shaped by masculinity. And here I want to say that the men definitely emphasized environmental reasons behind veganism, particularly in communication with other men, because that's what they thought that resonates with other men. And this comes from ideals of masculinity in society, where men are more associated with like facts and reason. And so this is actually this example of how talking about veganism is quite contextual. So in conversations with other men, because veganism and kind of care about animals is feminized and stigmatized, so they kind of thought that environmental reasons are more factual and they can be not so easily dismissed. And so they kind of presented facts about the environmental impact of consuming animals, as opposed to like animal suffering, which can be regarded as more subjective. And so Urmas here says, I have thought that the environmental aspect is more convincing because it's not so much based on emotion. Well, it depends whom you're talking to, but usually the ethical aspect is associated with emotions. Although protecting the environment can also be very emotional, linked to emotions, but somehow if I want to give a rational answer, I want to give a rational answer, not an emotional one. So but he actually also understands how the environmental concerns can be very much linked to emotions as well. And definitely, so this is something that some ecofeminist scholars have also criticized. We all know the work of Tom Regan, Peter Singer, who are these very famous animal advocacy, animal rights scholars, and they actually say that we should dismiss emotions when we relate to other animals. We should kind of be very rational. And so this is something, that division again, we can kind of challenge here. But I wanted to also say that the few men, they were quite critical about their own tendency to dismiss emotions and to prefer kind of rationality in conversations about veganism. And they kind of thought that it would be good to cultivate emotional responses within men towards the suffering of animals. So Ilmari here from Finland says, I rely on the, all those facts and like numbers and figures, but just personally, because that's kind of me, that's the things I'm better with. I don't know if that's some kind of, masculinity issues that I have, but I feel like I should also work on that personally, like go to these emotions even with men. So he thinks that's important, and some other men also had this critical approach. But yes, and some men also said that it's really important actually to emphasize the animal ethics side of veganism that I mentioned. And here is another quote. If I refer to the environmental reasons, then many people are like, okay, but I don't own a car and so I can eat meat. I don't have to be vegan. So that's also why I kind of stopped using the environmental arguments. I stopped saying that because now I'm saying it's because of ethical reasons, just because I kind of want to be more honest about it. So he, for example, is bothered by that distinction between what you kind of personally consider important and what gets presented and how, right? Okay, so definitely, so what I found, and I think that's significant, there's a distinction between sort of values that these men hold, or they also talk about in among other vegans versus what they express to non-vegans and how they communicate veganism. And definitely where that comes from too, it's important to understand So when there are these interactions between people, so it's always, we try to kind of maintain some kind of good atmosphere of solidarity in these interactions. And if you are like a vegan killjoy, I like this expression, it's by Richard Twine, vegan killjoy. You know, as a vegan, you ruin omnivores' mood sometimes by just being a vegan in the room and when they know that you're vegan. So that's because, you know, you kind of send implicitly like a moral evaluation to them eating animals. So if you are this vegan killjoy, you are breaking this tacit implicit agreement that kind of is the basis of social interactions. So actually these men try to avoid being a preachy vegan very much. So maybe many of you have heard about this preachy vegan expression. And interestingly, they were really thinking that that's a very negative figure, but none of them really had met any preachy vegan. It was sort of, I think it was sort of this cultural figure that vegans don't want to associate themselves with. So they definitely tried not to be preachy vegans. But yeah, so they tried to appear more socially acceptable and less confrontational, and tried to make veganism more palatable among omnivores. So they kind of foregrounded like food and health elements of veganism and downplayed animal ethics. And in a way, they ended up communicating plant-based eating or diets rather than veganism. And so they depoliticized veganism. And also the same thing could be said about the way they talked about environmental reasons behind veganism to others. So that also kind of depoliticizes veganism if you leave the animals out of the discussion totally. And as I said before, this discourse can be very anthropocentric and not really decenter humans, because we may say that we are worried about the human species future, and for humanity's sake, we should, you know, try to preserve nature. And also about masculinity a little bit. So presenting veganism through environmental issues. So it really, and if you don't sort of emphasize those emotions so much there, so if you just talk about the, you know, water and land kind of impact and footprint and everything, that a lot of facts and figures, so you kind of rely on these hard facts that are masculinized, and yeah, kind of avoid displaying emotions, and avoid talking about feminized animal suffering, which is associated with emotions. So definitely these men have quite gendered assumptions about what is acceptable and effective in communicating veganism to others, including with other men. And some of this communication that they do aligns with these traditional ideals and performances of masculinity. And definitely there's also consequences for how then omnivores perceive vegans and veganism. When veganism gets communicated to them in a certain way. Yeah, and definitely that's a very difficult issue, because I myself have also struggled with that, and I in some situations haven't emphasized the animal ethics of veganism, and I feel bad about it. I think it's problematic, but I feel like that in this situation with these people, it might be difficult to do that. So I think it's tricky, and I think many of us have experienced that. Yes, that's all. Thank you.